I'm Fred Pleitgen in Kiev, Ukraine, and this is CNN.
Thanks very much for watching. A special invitation. Log on tomorrow night for the premiere of the newscast with Wolf Blitzer, only on our brand new streaming network, CNN Plus. That debuts 7:30 p.m. Eastern. You can sign up at cnnplus.com. Don Lemon tonight, live from Ukraine, starts right now. And Don is joining us. So Don, you know, I was watching on Saturday when all this was unfolding. You were in Lviv, relatively safe area, and all of a sudden I see you there, and they had just attacked oil depots not far away from where you were, and you show up. How scared were you?
Well, I was careful, more careful than scared, and I would say surprised that they actually came this far towards the border where the president was and where you were covering the president. So I wasn't scared because, as you see in that, I'm wearing tactical gear. I'm wearing the helmet and the flak jacket, which is protocol here. Most of the citizens, as you know, don't have those in their homes. Many people were wondering why most citizens don't have flak jackets and helmets for this kind of thing. But it was, once I got closer, it was, I wasn't scared, but it was a bit of a stunning scene because, Wolf, I'd grown up around chemical plants, and I've seen explosions at chemical plants and fires similar to this, where there were controlled burns on it, and there would be ashes and soot raining down on neighborhoods, and we'd have to paint our houses every year and our cars because it would rust the cars and mess up the houses. So I know what it can do to the environment, but you never know. This city was a safe haven, and I think that some people, Wolf, may have had a false sense of security about Lviv, but now they don't. So at any second, people are concerned that another missile or other missiles might fall somewhere in Lviv as well.
Because it was surprising, because supposedly the Russians say, well, we're really only interested in eastern Ukraine, and we're going to leave western Ukraine out of it. And then all of a sudden, the next day, they're bombing this oil facility right near Lviv, which is in western Ukraine, and supposedly a relatively safe area.
A relatively safe area, Wolf, and really close to residential neighborhoods. There were actually two strikes here. One was in a military facility. The other one was in this oil depot or fuel depot. And I think the one in the fuel depot, obviously, and in the military facility, I think it was strategic because I guess they were trying to send a message to the military and also cut off some oil supply, possibly. And also, the mayor here said maybe it was Vladimir Putin's way of saying hello to Joe Biden, who was not far away in neighboring Poland. So we don't know, but we did watch your coverage, and the president there meeting with folks, and I think it was important for him to be there on that night when they struck a city which had been a relatively safe haven, Wolf.
Well, I just want you to be.
Thank you, sir. I'll see you tomorrow.
I just want you to be safe over there. Be careful. We will certainly stay in touch.
Thank you, Wolf. I really appreciate that. This is Don Lemon tonight. I am here in western Ukraine in Lviv, where we are hearing air raid sirens tonight. It happened just moments ago. Explosions heard in Kyiv and cities across the country just hours before talks between Russia and Ukraine are supposed to resume in Istanbul. President Volodymyr Zelensky is saying that Ukraine is ready to accept a neutral status as part of a peace deal, which would mean they wouldn't be able to join NATO. But as Russia continues to attack from the air, Vladimir Putin's forces have stalled in several parts of Ukraine. That is according to a senior U.S. defense official who says that Russia has made no progress in moving towards Kyiv or elsewhere in the north. In Irpin, a suburb of Kyiv, the mayor telling CNN Ukraine has freed the area from Russia, but it is still getting shelled. Mariupol's mayor says that Russia controls the humanitarian corridor that's the only escape from the besieged city, but he vows Ukraine's soldiers will stand to the end. You see so much destruction here. You can get numb to it. But just remember, days ago, somebody lived here. Somebody lived in Mariupol in those bombed out buildings. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden is pushing back today on questions about his speech in Poland this weekend when he said that this about Vladimir Putin, and I quote, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power."
It was expressing my outrage. He shouldn't remain in power. Just like, you know, bad people shouldn't continue to do bad things. But it doesn't mean we have a fundamental policy to do anything to take Putin down in any way. The last part of the speech was talking to the Russian people, telling them what we thought. And I was communicating this to not only the Russian people, but the whole world. This is just stating a simple fact that this kind of behavior is totally unacceptable.
What we have been seeing in Ukraine for more than a month, the death, the destruction, homes, schools, hospitals obliterated, innocent people from babies to elderly people forced to run for their lives. All that is unacceptable. The president is saying exactly what most of the world feels about Vladimir Putin. So we're going to start our coverage tonight with our senior international correspondent, Fred Pleitgen. He is live for us tonight in Kyiv. Fred, hello to you. A lot of shelling there in Kyiv today, and reports that Russian forces are trying to block supply routes into the capital. Give us the latest, please.
Yeah, it's been a really fierce battle today. I would say even more intense than we've had over the past couple of days. We also had, like you guys just had, air raid sirens throughout the better part of the day. But what we also had is massive explosions that we've been hearing here from our position and seeing as well. Massive plumes of smoke coming up, especially over the northwest of the city. And that's exactly what you were just talking about, that area of Irpin, where the Ukrainian forces now say they've taken 100% control of that area. However, there is still big shelling going on, and the Ukrainians are acknowledging that the Russians certainly are shooting back. And it was the deputy defense minister that said the Russians are trying to create corridors around the city, seeming to mean that they're trying to cut off supply routes, but the Ukrainians are saying they're holding them up. Now, the Russians certainly are firing back in a big way, and there's a lot of civilians who unfortunately are being harmed in that. We were able to go to the north, or in the north of Kiev, towards the north of Kiev, and what we saw there in a small village was also utter devastation brought on by that shelling. Here's what we saw.
We drove to the village Novi Petrivce, north of Kyiv, only a few miles from the front line. Even the streets here are pockmarked with shrapnel and massive impact craters. Whole buildings laid to waste. I mean, just look at the utter destruction caused by this massive explosion. There's some really thick brick walls, and even they were annihilated by the force of whatever landed here. The people here tell us they only felt one really large explosion, and it wounded several people and killed a small child. That child was 2-year-old Stepan, killed while in his bed when the house came under fire. These videos, given to us by local authorities, show the chaos in the aftermath. As the wounded appear in shock, residents and rescuers try to save those who were inside. Stepan pronounced dead on the scene.
Certainly was an awful scene, even days later, to witness that as we were down there. And you know, the people that we spoke to, they said they really didn't see any military in that area, and many of them, we asked them if they understand why this happened to them, why the Russians came and shelled their houses, and they simply said they had absolutely no idea. Obviously, this is a district north of Kiev where people sort of are just trying to live their lives, but the front line only about 3.5 miles away from where we were, Don.
Fred, I mean, those images are just awful. I mean, seeing that child is just unbelievable. I want to talk now, Fred, about the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, telling PBS NewsHour tonight that Russians are not shelling any civilian targets. Well, that defies what every journalist is witnessing on the ground and the very pictures that we're showing on television.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at the numbers, it certainly does seem to defy a lot of the things that journalists are witnessing and the people on the ground are witnessing. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the city of Mariupol, where the local council there says that more than 90% of the buildings in that city have been severely damaged, you know, then only if you believe that 90% of Mariupol is a military installation, then would what the Kremlin spokesman said seem valid. And the same thing also obviously we see in the outskirts of Kiev as well, where we were. There were obviously homes that were badly damaged. There were homes that were completely destroyed. We saw a tennis club that was essentially laid to waste here on the outskirts of Kiev. You also have residential buildings that have been hit, apartment blocks that have been hit as well. Obviously not military areas. So in some cases, maybe there was a military infrastructure stationed in those areas, but certainly not in all cases, and certainly not in 90% of Mariupol, as that city is also being laid to waste. And there's so many other places in Ukraine, Don, where that's also the case. You take the town of Chernihiv, for instance, which is also completely surrounded by Russian forces, and they're apparently shelling into that area as well. So there is a large civilian toll that all of this has taken, especially in cities that are surrounded by those Russian forces, Don.
All right, Fred, thank you very much. We appreciate it. The humanitarian situation is as dire as it gets in Mariupol. The city is in ruins after weeks of Russian shelling, and now Russian forces control the humanitarian corridor in and out of the city. CNN's Phil Black now with the very latest.
Russia is so close to taking the prize of Mariupol. These soldiers are already celebrating. The flag going up on this local government building is from one of the Russian-backed separatist regions in Ukraine's east. The Ukrainians peeled off. Praise the Almighty, this soldier says. The guys are in a good mood, and we are working according to the order of Putin. We get rare glimpses of Russia's efforts to take the city street by street. These soldiers are from the Russian Republic of Chechnya. It's propaganda video from their leader, which CNN has geolocated to Mariupol. Mariupol's mayor, Vadim Boychenko, tells me the fight isn't over. What happened, or what has happened, to the Ukrainian soldiers defending Mariupol? Are there any left? They hold the line and they stand to the end, he says, to the last drop of blood. It's not only Ukrainian soldiers trapped here. The city council estimates there are still around 170,000 civilians in this devastated city, and 90% of homes have been damaged or destroyed. Valentina enters what's left of the only home she's ever known, the place where she raised her family. She wasn't here when the shell hit. She's been hiding in the basement. She doesn't want to leave. She knows she can't stay. But many will never leave. The council says almost 5,000 people have been killed during the 4-week siege, including more than 200 children. Russia is so close to taking its prize, but it will be a blackened shell of a city, and it's unlikely the people they're conquering will ever forgive them. Phil Black, CNN, Lviv, Western Ukraine.
All right, Phil, thank you very much. We appreciate that. In just hours, the next round of talks between Russia and Ukraine will begin in Turkey. So after weeks of brutal fighting, what are both sides looking for at the negotiating table? Joining me now to discuss this is a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and that is John Herbst. He is a senior director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate you joining us to discuss this. Good evening to you. The stakes for the next round of talks between Russia and Ukraine are incredibly high. Zelensky is saying that Ukraine would accept neutral and non-nuclear status. What would that mean in practice?
Well, it's pretty simple. One of the conditions Putin has had for ending this war, his new invasion, is that Ukraine be established itself as a neutral nation, not part of NATO, not part of the West. And Zelensky, in his interest in finding an honorable out for his country, is willing to consider this. But Putin's objectives go far beyond Ukrainian neutrality. He wants Ukraine to disarm so he could essentially dominate the country. He also wants land that is part of Ukrainian territory, which Zelensky is not prepared to give up. So I have very low expectations for these negotiations, because the negotiators do not seem to reflect Putin's ideas, which are still for essentially unconditional surrender by Zelensky.
Ukraine says that they will not accept territorial losses, but there are concerns that Russia might try to split Ukraine into like North and South Korea. I mean, even if that satisfied Putin, it seems like there'd be major issues with that deal. What do you think about that?
Okay, you're right that if Putin were able to seize half the country, there would still be the other half that he would want. But Putin is not able to seize half the country. Right now, Russian forces occupy maybe 20% of Ukraine. And occupy means that they control the roads in a few cities, but not even within those cities, as we see in Kherson, where people protest almost every day. If Russia tries to hold on to those territories, Ukraine will maintain military resistance. There will not be a peace. So I think that, and of course I don't think this is what Putin really wants anyway. So these are ideas which people in Russia who are not Putin are suggesting, and people in the West are only too happy to grab this illusion of peace. But Putin's objective is to dominate Ukraine. And Zelensky and the Ukrainian people will not let that happen.
You know, Putin will have the final say over anything decided in the negotiations. Can this war end without Zelensky and Putin at the table, Ambassador?
This war can end with the two leaders of Ukraine and Russia making decisions. But right now, Putin still does not understand that his military has been stalled, that they are unable to establish the domination he wants. He refuses to understand that. This idea of splitting the country comes from a Russian colonel general. It does not come from Putin or from anyone speaking on Putin's behalf. So again, people are now gyrating around this concept, but until Putin himself endorses it, it has no real status. And again, Putin's still seeking to change the leadership in Ukraine. And he's given no indication he's willing to let Ukraine pursue a truly neutral foreign policy, as opposed to a quote-unquote neutral foreign policy, which he, Putin, dictates.
Ambassador, Putin's spokesperson telling PBS tonight, that Russia would only use nuclear weapons if the existence of Russia was at stake. Listen to this and then we'll discuss it.
Any outcome of the operation, of course, is not a reason for usage of a nuclear weapon. We have a security concept that very clearly states that only when there is a threat for existence of the state in our country, we can use, and we will actually use, nuclear weapons to eliminate the threat for the existence of our country.
So he had an interview with our Cristiano Amanpour last week. I think he went a beat past what he said to Cristiano, though it was the same thing in tone. So is he saying that they'd only use weapons if there is an existential threat to Russia, but the outcome of the war in Ukraine doesn't necessarily pose that kind of a threat? How do you interpret that?
It in no way, Russia losing its current war of aggression in Ukraine is not an existential threat to Russia. In fact, it would lead to improvement of Russia's international position because it would no longer be isolated once they gave up this aggressive war and barbaric war in Ukraine. But Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons as a way to intimidate the West from taking strong steps to prevent the murder of Ukrainian civilians, women and children, and also to protect major Western interests. And that's very unfortunate. There's a long history during the Cold War of nuclear weapons used as a deterrence as the United States defended its vital interests. If Jack Kennedy every 3 seconds said, gee, I can't do X to deal with Soviet missiles in Cuba because of the escalation factor, as opposed to merely thinking about it quietly, we would never have gotten those Russian missiles out of Cuba. This administration has been too intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. We can manage those threats and still protect our interests.
I'm interested in what you have to say about this, because President Biden says that he's not walking back anything after saying that Putin can't remain in power this weekend. And you are one of the people who have said that those remarks were a mistake. Today, the president said that he was expressing his outrage and it wasn't about policy. Do you think that settles the matter? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this was an unfortunate statement by the president. He and his team realized it was a mistake, but the president does not want to admit that he made a mistake, which presidents have a right to do. The problem is that the Russians will remember this and Putin will weaponize it. And the odd and the sad thing is that this is something which does in fact provoke the Russians, provoke Putin, more than us sending those MiGs from Eastern Europe into Ukraine, or us making sure that Ukraine has serious high-altitude anti-aircraft missiles. Those are the things we should be doing quietly and not talking about, sending Putin off into the dustbin of history. Our interests are in making sure Ukraine has the weapons it needs to defeat this Russian aggression so that Putin does not try this against our Baltic allies.
Ambassador, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Russian forces stalled across the country. Ukrainians fighting fiercely. Are Vladimir Putin's forces sitting ducks? And what does it say about this war that these kinds of things are going on, that things are going so badly for Russia just 1 month in?
You can help the refugees from Ukraine. Join the over 70,000 who've already raised millions for food, shelter, and more. Explore CNN.com/impact. Click to take action.
This is the result of one single blast.
3.3 million Ukrainians have now fled this country.
You don't have to go far to find a family who has been displaced.
We just heard an air raid siren ring out.
We run down for cover. It is hard to imagine life returning here.
In Kiev, Dnipro,
Poland.
This is CNN.
Today we live in an unpredictable environment and news races around the world at breakneck speed.
Our engine continues, our impetus, our momentum.
My show brings you the latest news and top news makers. Give me the facts on voter fraud.
There has never been a moment where voter fraud has affected the outcome of an election.
And we also dive below the headlines to explore vital issues impacting our lives.
Normally this theatre would be filled with people and art and debate and energy, and so now we have to rely on the two of us.
How interesting is it to be Tyler Mitchell today? It's crucial we make sense of what's happening. There seems to be some confusion that maybe you can clear up. Where are the US forces in Syria going? And fully understand what's at stake.
What's happening now in the world is a great thing because people are talking about subjects they never did before.
Aman Pour, tonight on CNN.
For World Sport.
World Sport.
For World Sport, I'm Amanda Davis.
I'm Patrick Snell.
I'm Alex Thomas. I'm Coy Wire.
I'm Don Riddell.
I'm Andy Scholl.
And this
is CNN.
Back now live in Ukraine, shelling happening in and around Kyiv tonight following a Russian strike in the west of Ukraine on a fuel depot earlier today. Let's get the latest military developments with CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel, appreciate you joining us once again to give us your perspective on this and to take us through the map there and the strategy. Ukrainians are fighting ferociously. Russian forces are largely stalled in several parts of Ukraine. Over a month into this war, just over a month into this war, what options does Putin have right now?
Well, that's a great question, Don. What we're looking at here is, of course, the area around Kyiv, which is right here, of course, and then you've got Kharkiv and you've got Mariupol. All of these areas are centers of fighting, and that is one of the biggest issues that they have. Where do they divide their forces and what do they do next? It seems as if The Kyiv battle is basically stalled out for Putin, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But when you look at Kharkiv and Mariupol, you have two very different scenarios fairly close to each other. Kharkiv, the Russians have not been able to move forward, even though Kharkiv is within 30 miles of the Russian border. Mariupol, on the other hand, appears to be in essence, a Russian victory at this point, and that's because the city is a complete wasteland, completely destroyed by the Russians. Over 90% of the buildings there are completely gone. This area right here in the south around Kherson, that's another area where the Russians had thought they could move in different directions, such as to the west or to the north of this. None of that is happening. It is, at least at this present time. So what we're dealing with here is Putin has to figure out what he wants to do next. And one of the possible things that he can do is divide the country, as you had been speaking about earlier. And that would mean something like this. Would go over to Russia, and that would be a possible solution to what the Russians are thinking, at least a temporary solution. But that is in a really short form how the Russians are looking at this. They are stalled out and they don't know which way they're going to go next, but their goals still remain the same, which is to topple the government in Kyiv. They're just going to take a longer time to get there.
Colonel, UK defense officials say the notorious Russian private military group Wagner has deployed to eastern Ukraine for combat operations. It's interesting because what does it mean that Putin is replacing dead generals and commanders with mercenaries?
Well, mercenaries are, of course, soldiers for hire. You know, they had them in the American Revolution with the Hessians, and they've been around throughout history. These guys are really notorious, though, and they don't really replace the generals or the colonels, but what they do is they provide terror for the groups that are here. They are soldiers that are not really ones who follow the rules of war. They're primarily deployed in this area right here in the eastern part of the country, as you mentioned. Their possible mission is to mop up what's going on in Mariupol and finish off the rest of the resistance there. They could potentially be used in other areas like Kharkiv and potentially in Melitopol and some of the other areas around here in the south. So they are going to be the group that would be used to do those kinds of mopping up operations, and they're known for their brutality, and that's what makes them particularly gruesome and not ones to mess with if you're standing there alone fighting these guys.
Oh, just awful. The Pentagon is deploying 6 U.S. Navy electronic warfare jets to Germany, accompanied by more than 200 air crew, pilots, and maintenance staff. Now, the planes can be used for radar jamming. So tell us about these jets. Could they be used to help Ukraine from NATO airspace?
Absolutely, they could be, because they have the range that would allow them to do what's called suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD in the military acronym. What they have is pods on the aircraft that provide jamming capabilities. They also have missiles that can be used to fire at targets if they're targets that are active, that are painting, as we call it, this particular jet or other jets in a package. These Navy jets are based on the FA-18, which is the basic airframe that we have here. But the jamming pods here are very important, because what they do is they go after enemy radar, and they make it hard for the enemy to figure out where Ukrainian assets would be at or NATO assets would be at. So they're a critically important asset. We use them all the time for our combat operations, and they could very well be used for Ukraine in this case.
Wow, that's some serious stuff there. That is, we learned a lot, as we do every night from you. Thank you very much, Colonel. Appreciate it.
You bet, Don.
Banned in Russia. Russian journalists interviewing Ukraine's President Zelensky, and now those journalists are being investigated. Stay with us.
This is CNN.
I'm Sarah Seidner in Minneapolis. I'm Dr. Sanjay Gupta in New York City.
I'm Kyon Law in Salt Lake City.
I'm Miguel Marquez in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota.
I'm Adrienne Broadus in Chicago.
I'm Omar Jimenez in Minneapolis.
This is the screen where it happens. The moments that can change the world.
These are the faces we see, the voices we empower.
Who's on the screen and who's behind it.
This is the work that continues, who we are today and what we can become.
This is where our curiosity can lead us when inclusion matters.
This is why more perspectives make us stronger and how our mission can inspire tomorrow.
This is journalism that reflects the world we live in.
We think of the metaverse as the next iteration of social media. And although there's only a few 100,000 people using it today, we anticipate that over the next few years, there's going to be millions of people joining these platforms and eventually billions of people using these platforms. This is not a fad. I mean, we can look at companies like Facebook doing the largest rebrand in history to Meta. We can look at companies like Samsung. Even the fashion brands like Gucci, Balenciaga, Adidas, and Nike are all establishing a presence there. And so what I would say to people that are still skeptical, say this is, maybe are the same type of people that were skeptical about social media and its impact on advertising, and maybe even people who are skeptical about the internet. My prediction is that within 24 months, every single large corporation is going to have to need a presence in the metaverse in the same way that they need a website.
I'm Hala Garani in Lviv, Ukraine. This is CNN.
Tonight, Vladimir Putin's government banning an interview with Ukrainian President Zelensky from being broadcast in Russia. The interview was conducted by some of Russia's most prominent independent journalists who now face investigation for possibly violating strict new censorship laws. Zelensky's taunting the Kremlin, accusing it of being afraid to let Russians know the truth about the invasion of Ukraine. More from CNN's Matthew Chance now.
This was a groundbreaking interview with what the Kremlin sees as an enemy head of state, and a first for Russian journalists covering this war. But for many Russians, the words of President Zelensky, including his offers of compromise for peace, will never be heard. Russian authorities banning the interview before it was even broadcast, and now vowing to investigate the journalists who carried it out. Journalists like Tikhon Zyadko, the editor-in-chief of TV Rain, an independent Russian channel forced off the air earlier this month. No to war, his editorial staff said, as they walked off their Moscow set.
There is a digital iron curtain on the Ukrainian topic in Russia, and we see that there is I would say, military censorship in Russia, and all the information which is not going from Russian Ministry of Defense or from the Kremlin is forbidden. So it is really important to tell the people the truth, or at least to tell them what the other side of the conflict or the war thinks.
Why do you think it is so important for the Kremlin to keep such a tight grip on that flow of information and on the message they want Russian people to hear?
Almost the whole story of Russian war in Ukraine is a big lie, just from the beginning. Even the word war is not being used by the Russian government. We understand that this is not true. We understand that there is a war. We understand that a lot of civilians die there every day. And we understand that a lot of Russian soldiers as well die there every day. And Vladimir Zelensky, he is the person who has a lot of information on what is going on there. And of course, he gave us this information during this interview. And of course, the Russian government doesn't want this information to be spread in Russia.
This is what the Kremlin does want Russians to see. Blanket coverage on state media of its special military operation, with Russian forces cast as liberators and heroes. There have been displays of dissent, like this one of a journalist holding up an anti-war placard during Russia's main daily newscast. The programme has quickly cut away. But for millions of Russians, the idea their country is a force for good, fighting neo-Nazis in Ukraine, being welcomed by the people there, is much more appealing than the hard truth.
Why is it such a successful strategy? Why are people so ready to believe that propaganda?
There is a huge part of the Russian society of people who are in denial, people who just do not want to admit that their country, our country, my country, is bombing civilian objects in schools and the hospitals, etc., etc. It's hard to admit it, that maybe there is something very wrong with your homeland, and that somehow me as a citizen of Russia is somehow responsible for it.
Hard to admit, perhaps, but with tough new information laws, increasingly illegal too. Russia's criminalising of the truth is this war's latest casualty.
Well, Russia's most acclaimed critical newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, whose reporter was also one of the journalists who interviewed President Zelensky, and of course whose editor won the Nobel Peace Prize this year, has now announced it'll suspend publication until the conflict in Ukraine is over, following warnings it said it received from the Russian authorities. It's not entirely unexpected, given the increasingly hostile atmosphere in Russia right now to the independent media. But it is still a shocking sign of how bad the situation in Russia has become. Don.
Matthew Chance, thank you very much. So Puck Washington correspondent Julia Yaffe is here. Just how many Russians are still in denial as to the reality of what's going on in Ukraine, and how long can that last? We'll talk about that next.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
so many questions about what is the federal government doing. Do you get the anger that is out here?
How concerned are you about the front line?
You don't believe that there's a racial divide here?
Looking back, as president, did you tell the story of race in America enough, do you think?
All the places I've been and all the things I've seen, all the people I've talked to, I carry with me. They're part of what I do right here, holding the powerful accountable, keeping them honest.
AC 360, Tuesday through Saturday only on CNN.
When the kids are home and those after-school cravings kick in, that doesn't have to be a recipe for eating junk food. Try whipping up a smoothie for the kiddos instead. They can be tasty and nutritious when made of strawberry. And the antioxidants in strawberries can help boost your immune system. Or try sweet potato to add a little more zing. Try blending sweet potato, cauliflower, rice, almond butter, and then add some of your favorite spices like cinnamon and nutmeg or vanilla. This smoothie is packed with protein and fiber that can help kids stay full longer. And avocado toast can make for a great snack for older kids. Avocados are packed with healthy fats and fiber. For younger kids, keep it simple with yogurt and graham crackers or berries and yogurt. Yogurt is a great source for several nutrients, including bone-building calcium and muscle-building protein.
I'm Andrea Vena. I'm the Chief Climate and Sustainability Officer at the European Space Agency. The great responsibility that ESA has to be responsible is linked very much to the fact that since decades our programs are contributing to the understanding of climate change. Our satellites are contributing to the climate variables that are used by scholars and scientists all over the world to identify what are the hotspots for climate change. Therefore, we feel accountable. We know what is the situation, and therefore it is very much important for ESA to be on the leading edge for fighting against climate change.
Moscow's media watchdog furthering its censorship of journalists and media in Russia. The agency warning Russian news outlets against publishing Ukrainian President Zelensky's interview with Russian journalists over the weekend. Independent Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta, whose editor-in-chief won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, announcing it's suspending publication until the end of the war after receiving another warning from the agency. So let's bring in now Puck founding partner and Washington correspondent, Julia Yaffe. We always love having you on, Julia. Thank you so much for joining us. So listen, President Zelensky is accusing Moscow of being frightened by journalists after banning his interview from being published. The Kremlin says that Russia isn't afraid, but would there be any other reason to block it?
Well, the reason to block it is to make sure that Russians don't learn the truth about the war that their country is waging in Ukraine. They've gotten a very sanitized and cleaned up version so far through the tightly controlled Kremlin-owned media, and to not see Zelensky in any kind of humanized, approachable way to so that he can still be seen as a puppet of the Nazis and of the U.S.
So Russia is shutting down the independent media outlets. They're blocking social media apps. They're banning what Putin considers fake news about the country's military. Are Russians aware of all of this censorship, and are there ways for people to get access to real information, or do they just not even know it's out there and just ignorance is bliss?
I think it depends who you're talking about. If you're talking about younger people, if you're talking about educated people in cities, they know it's out there, and a lot of them do pursue it and look for it through VPNs, through other channels, for example, Telegram, which is a Russian-developed messaging app, also now has kind of information channels. But those are people who, as a rule, want to know what's going on because they don't already believe the government. They already know the government is lying to them. There are other people in Russia who know the government is lying to them, but don't really care and feel that if it's in the interests of the state, then it's okay. There have been several polls that show this, and a frightening number. Vast majority will say that it's okay for the government to lie to them from the television if it serves the state's interests. So some people.
Julia, we lost your last words. Repeat your last sentence. You said some people what?
I said some of them know they're being lied to, and polls have shown in recent years that a large and disconcerting majority of Russians know that state TV lies to them, but that they're okay with it if they feel that it's in the interests of the state.
Mm-hmm. So, Julia, Russia is expected. Russia expected that this war would be over quickly, but its military has faced a lot of setbacks. I mean, you're tuned into what's happening in Russia. Are you seeing any cracks in state media over how this war is going?
We've seen a lot of prominent anchors from these Kremlin-owned channels resign. A lot of them have fled the country, and for them, the war was a kind of the point where they've cracked, and they couldn't. They just said they couldn't do this work anymore, couldn't push this propaganda anymore, whereas before they were, for whatever reason, able to. And there have been reports trickling out of Russia that there's a lot of discontent in these newsrooms, in part because they all know what's going on. They have access to Reuters, to the AP, to the New York Times, to all the information that we're seeing in the West, but their viewers are not seeing. And it's apparently, according to some of these reports, is getting harder and harder for these so-called journalists to square what they are telling Russian viewers and what they know to be the truth.
Julia, you had a recent piece in Puck, and you spoke with a Russian sociologist at an independent pollster that has been designated as a foreign agent, but Putin prosecutor, by Putin prosecutors, I should say. And you discussed how many in the U.S. think that Russians protest in the streets. Putin will stop the war. So Russian protests in the streets, and that Putin will stop the war if they do that. He told you that he wouldn't count on it. Is the West wrong to expect a big outcry from Russia with people protesting in the streets? And if they actually do find information, it sounds like that's what you're saying, because you're saying it doesn't matter if it's good for the state, and he's cracking down on protests.
Well, it's interesting. That sociologist told me an interesting story about one of the focus groups he did, where an older woman told him, you know, I know that if I watched the BBC, for example, I would have a totally different understanding, not just of the war, but of the world. I just don't want to know. And I don't want to change my understanding, because everything she knows and believes to be true and has believed to be true for the last few decades would come tumbling down. And that's very scary for people. I think because people are scared, because this censorship isn't new, because Putin has built this authoritarian regime not overnight, but over the last 22 years, because he has built it on the memory and the historical reflexes developed over 70 years of brutal Soviet rule of political terror. I think Russians are too scared, even if they're against the war, to come out en masse. It's interesting, by the way, you know, the riot police that traditionally beat up protesters, you see these crazy images of them dragging them to the vans. They're now being sent to fight to Ukraine, and apparently hundreds of them are quitting and asking not to be sent, which is interesting. They don't want to kill Ukrainians because they have arms, but beating up peaceful protesters in Moscow or in St. Petersburg is apparently totally fine for them.
It's interesting. It sounds like an interesting sociology lesson for America, you know, to learn as well what happens if things escalate. Thank you, Julia. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Nearly 4 million Ukrainians fleeing into neighboring countries, thousands of them being housed in a convention center in Warsaw, Poland. It is the largest refugee center in Europe right now, and we're going to take you inside right after this.
My son, calm down now.
Why do you sweat like Amrova?
My uncle no go bite. Uncle!
What happened?
Uncle, meet Andy. He has come to ask for my hand in marriage.
Good morning and good afternoon, sir. What about good night? Are you seeing a movie? What nonsense!
Son, you are in control.
No, sir. It's my parents in the village. I'm doing a video call since they can't be here.
Glow Brigadier Plus is here. Existing Glow customers will get 400% bonus on every recharge and 100 MB data bonus on first recharge of the month. New Glow customers will get 1,000 Naira welcome bonus. To activate, buy a new Glow SIM today or dial *777# for existing Glow customers.
The Omega Seamaster is the longest running product line still produced by Omega. The Omega Seamaster was first introduced in 1948 and was loosely based upon designs that were made for the British Royal Navy towards the end of World War II. What's interesting is most Omega Seamasters will have a seahorse adorned case back. So in the back of the case of the watch, you'll see a seahorse. And this actually pays tribute to Neptune, the Roman god of the sea. The seahorse logo was actually conceived by the engraver Jean-Pierre Burrell, who also has a bit of history with the sea and also from an artistic perspective. And he was actually inspired by an image of Neptune driving a chariot pulled by seahorses, which is why the seahorses are, again, depicted wearing bridles and on the back of Omega's Seamaster-based watches.
Today, we live in an unpredictable environment, and news races around the world at breakneck speed.
Our engine continues, our impetus, our momentum.
My show brings you the latest news and top news makers. Give me the facts on voter fraud.
There has never been a moment where voter fraud has affected the outcome of an election.
And we also dive below the headlines to explore vital issues impacting our lives.
Normally, this theatre would be filled with people and art and debate and energy, and so now we have to rely on the two of us.
How interesting is it to be Tyler Mitchell today? It's crucial we make sense of what's happening. There seems to be some confusion that maybe you can clear up. Where are the US forces in Syria going? And fully understand what's at stake.
What's happening now in the world is a great thing because people are talking about subjects they never did before.
Amanpour, tonight on CNN.
In a special ongoing season of the Tug of War podcast, CNN reporters are on the ground in Ukraine, documenting Russia's invasion, the escalating conflict, and what it means for the rest of the world. Tug of War. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The refugee crisis spurred by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is staggering. Nearly 4 million people have fled the country, more than half of them to Poland. CNN's Kyung Law is in Warsaw, in the largest refugee center in Europe.
You are looking at the largest refugee hub in all of Europe. All of these are cots, places where people have basically taken everything that they could carry and turned into their home. You can see that there are these little pods of blankets, children laying on some of these cots. There are cribs here. 95% of the people in this place in Warsaw are women. children and the elderly. They're the ones